The old man walked into Courtroom, his wrists cuffed and his dark-lined face lowered. "State your name," the clerk asked. His voice was soft and trembling as he responded. "Elias Carter, Staff Sergeant, United States Marines." No one in the room could have guessed what was about to unfold. As the female judge glanced through his case file minutes later, her hand suddenly paused, her skin turned pale. That name, it belonged to the man who had once carried her brother to safety on a battlefield in Fallujah. Elias Carter, 69 years old, shuffled nervously on the courtroom bench. His military coat, too large for his frail frame, swallowed his shoulders as he sat, an embodiment of years lost. His face, weathered and deep-set with sorrow, told a silent story of years spent fighting battles long after the war had ended. Once he had stood tall in his marine dress blues, medals shining with pride. But now he sat in a second-hand jacket, his hands shaking slightly as he gripped the edges of the bench. The harsh courtroom lights seemed to emphasize the deep lines of loss etched into his face. A soft murmur filled the room, but no one truly understood the weight of the man sitting before them. No one could see the lifetime of service that had shaped him, the sacrifices that had molded his character. The silence in the room was broken only by the sound of the judge flipping through his case file. She paused. Her fingers trembled slightly. As she read the name aloud, her eyes widening. The courtroom went quiet as Judge Olivia Parker's gaze lingered on the file in front of her. Elias Carter. The name seemed to resonate in the space around her, and suddenly the room grew colder. This was no ordinary defendant. Her eyes, now focused on the page, didn't miss the familiar dates, the military history, the mention of Fallujah, a place she had never imagined revisiting in her professional life, but one that had defined her personal history forever. It took only a few seconds for her to connect the dots. The face before her, the man in front of her, was the same one she had spent years trying to forget. This was the man who had carried her brother, Lieutenant Jack Parker, to safety during a deadly firefight. The man who had saved her brother's life before disappearing without a trace. Judge Parker's mind raced, the memories flooding back in a rush. She remembered her brother's words, how Jack had always spoken of the bravery of the man who saved him in Fallujah. "If not for him, none of us would have survived," Jack had said about the staff sergeant who had charged through enemy fire to save him, pulling him to safety before retreating. Jack had died in another ambush just weeks later, leaving behind a lifetime of unspoken gratitude for the Marine who had given him more time, more life, in the middle of a war zone. But now, here he was, sitting in front of her, not as a hero, but as a man caught in the system's endless cycle. She stared at the name on the case file, Elias Carter. It had never crossed her mind that she would see this man again, especially not in a courtroom like this. The very thought of it was almost surreal. The prosecutor's voice broke her thoughts, bringing her back to the present. "Your Honor, Mr. Carter has been warned multiple times about loitering behind Jefferson Street Cafe. The owner has filed complaints, and this is his third citation this year. We recommend a sentence of 30 days of community service and a no trespass order for downtown Newbridge." Judge Parker's hand clenched around the file and she took a deep breath. "Mr. Carter," she addressed the old man, her voice calm but carrying a weight that only someone who knew what he had done could understand. "Do you have legal representation today?" Elias shook his head slowly. His public defender had been pulled away on urgent business, and now, here he was, alone in the courtroom with only his memories for company. The judge's voice softened, her gaze now fixed on him. "Would you like to speak on your own behalf?" Elias cleared his throat, his voice gravelly as he spoke. "No excuses, ma'am. Just needed to stay warm." She pressed further, her tone now more inquisitive. "Why that location? Why behind the cafe?" Her eyes never left him as she waited for an answer. Elias hesitated, his eyes clouding with memories. "Jimmy the cook leaves food sometimes," he began. "I've known him since he was a boy. His father served with me in Desert Storm." The Words landed with a quiet heaviness, but the judge didn't break her gaze. "And your service?" she asked, a faint edge to her voice now. Elias sat up a little straighter, the weight of the past pressing down on him. "United States Marine Corps, Staff Sergeant 1975 to 1995, 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, Iraq." The words hung in the air, the power of his service history reverberating through the room. But they were just words, and the courtroom buzzed, with the noise of everyday life, completely unaware of the gravity behind them. Judge Parker made a quick mark on the file before continuing, but something in Elias's military record gave her pause. Before she could speak, the courtroom door opened suddenly. A sharply dressed man in a tailored navy suit strode in, his steps confident and precise. The murmurs in the room quieted as he approached the defense table. "I'm Alexander Ross," the man introduced himself, his voice steady. "I've just been retained to represent Mr. Carter. I apologize for the abruptness." Elias's eyes narrowed in confusion. He hadn't called for a lawyer, let alone one who wore cufflinks and polished leather shoes. This was highly unusual. The judge raised an eyebrow. "This court was not informed of new representation," she said, her tone even. Ross smiled politely. "It was a last-minute development, Your Honor. I respectfully request a brief recess to speak with my client." Judge Parker paused, her gaze shifting between Ross and Elias. She was unsure, but finally she nodded. "This court will recess for 15 minutes, she said before rising swiftly and stepping into her chambers. Inside her chambers, Judge Olivia Parker tried to regain her composure. She had seen many things during her 20 years on the bench, cases that weighed heavy, others that left their marks on her heart. But nothing had ever hit her like this. Elias Carter, the man standing in her courtroom, had once been a part of her family's most sacred history. He had saved her brother Jack in Fallujah. Yet now, here he was, sitting in front of her, a man forgotten by time, by the system that was supposed to take care of him. She looked at her phone, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for it. There were so many questions. Questions that she had carried for years but never had the courage to ask. She pressed the speed dial and waited. "Colonel Matthews, it's Olivia Parker," she said, her voice tight. "Yes, I know it's been a long time, but I need a favor, and I need it urgently." She listened intently, her mind racing as she made her request. Meanwhile, Elias sat in the courtroom, his eyes cast downward. The silence between him and his new attorney, Alexander Ross, hung heavily. The recess gave him time to think, time to reflect on how much had led him to this moment. Time seemed to stretch out, but he didn't move, his body aching from the years of service, the years of fighting battles he could no longer remember clearly. Ross, noticing the weariness in his client's eyes, sat beside him. "You've been through more than most men can bear," he said quietly, his tone sympathetic but direct. "But we're going to get this sorted out. You're not alone anymore." Elias looked at the younger man, his eyes heavy with decades of unspoken pain. "I can't afford this," he muttered. "I didn't ask for any of this." Ross gave a soft chuckle. "No one's asking you to pay. My firm, Williams, Ross & Parker, is taking this case pro bono." Elias frowned, puzzled. "Parker? Like the judge?" Ross nodded, his eyes betraying a hint of something deeper. "Exactly like the judge. Olivia Parker is one of the founding partners of the firm." The mention of the name made Elias's heart skip a beat, though he kept his expression unchanged. Across the hall, Olivia sat in her office, the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights the only sound. She stared at the photograph in front of her. It was a picture of her brother Jack taken during his commissioning. She had always cherished it, the way Jack smiled so proudly beside his fellow Marines, his arm resting around the shoulders of a young Elias Carter. She traced her finger along the edges of the picture, the weight of those years bearing down on her. In the years following Jack's death, Olivia had tried to find Elias. She had tried to track him down, but the military had told her he was redeployed and then discharged. No one could say where he had gone, and the search had faded over time. Now he was sitting in her courtroom, a broken version of the man she had always admired from a distance. She ran her fingers across the photograph one more time, and then, without a second thought, picked up the phone again. "Colonel Matthews," she said firmly, "I need you to find something for me. Something that could help Elias Carter. I need to know what happened to him, where he went, and why he's here. Now." The courtroom remained tense when Judge Parker returned. Her usual air of authority, steady and commanding, was slightly softened by the gravity of the situation. The door swung open, and she walked in, her head held high. Behind her, 3 Marines filed in, each in full uniform. A full colonel, a master sergeant, and a young corporal carrying a polished wooden case. The room's energy shifted immediately. Whispers traveled through the gallery like wildfire. The sight of these Marines, still proud, still resolute, contrasted sharply with the man sitting at the defense table, hunched and weary. Elias stood slowly as they entered. His body creaked in protest, his joints aching from years of service and neglect. Despite the discomfort, a part of him, an instinct buried deep within, caused him to stand straighter. His uniformed brothers had entered, and though they weren't in the same battalion or the same unit, he could still feel the bond of service that connected them all. Judge Parker took her seat, setting her glasses aside for the first time that day. She wasn't in the mood for formalities anymore. She needed to address this as it was, personally. "Before we proceed," she began, her voice surprisingly gentle, "I must share a personal connection to this case." She looked directly at Elias, her eyes softening for just a moment before she continued. "The Lieutenant Jack Parker mentioned earlier, that was my brother." Gasps echoed around the room. Elias's brow furrowed in confusion as the courtroom held its breath. The weight of the name was heavy, but it was nothing compared to the impact of hearing it spoken aloud. Judge Parker continued, her gaze never wavering from Elias. "My brother wrote home about a staff sergeant who saved his life in Fallujah. He said that this man ran through enemy fire like it didn't exist to pull him to safety." The words were raw, the truth of them cutting through the years of silence. "That man," she said, "was Sergeant Elias Carter." The room went still. Elias blinked, memories flooding back, memories of another time, another place. He remembered the firefight vividly, the chaos, the gunfire, the wounded. Jack. Jack Parker had been one of the men he had pulled to safety that day, but hearing Olivia speak those words, it was more than he had ever imagined. The colonel beside her, Colonel James Matthews, stepped forward, holding the polished wooden case carefully in his hands. He addressed the room with the authority of someone who had seen much and now had a mission to carry out. "Staff Sergeant Carter," he began, his voice strong and measured. "The Marine Corps has been trying to locate you for quite some time. Your personnel file was among thousands reviewed under the Veterans Reconsideration Initiative. New intelligence regarding your deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan warranted an update to both your commendations and your benefits." Elias's heart raced as Matthews opened the wooden case to reveal a medal, resting on deep blue velvet. A silence fell over the room as the weight of what was about to happen sank in. "By order of the Secretary of the Navy," Matthews continued, his voice gaining strength, "in recognition of extraordinary bravery on April 17, 2004, the Navy Cross is hereby awarded to Staff Sergeant Elias J. Carter, United States Marine Corps." The shock that rippled through the courtroom was palpable. The Navy Cross, the second highest honor for a Marine, was being awarded to a man who had lived in the shadows for so long. Elias stood frozen, unable to process what was happening. The years of struggle, the pain, the invisibility, all seemed to collapse into this one moment. Matthews paused and then added, "Your Silver Star has been formally upgraded as well." For a moment Elias could not speak. His jaw clenched, his eyes filled with confusion. "There must be some mistake," he said softly. "I didn't do anything special. I just did my job." "No mistake, Sergeant," Matthews replied, his tone firm but respectful, "and this recognition is long overdue." As Matthews spoke, the silver-haired Marine in the gallery stood tall, a sense of reverence in his posture. "Attention on deck," he called out crisply. One by one, other veterans and civilians in the room rose in unison, a tribute to the man who had saved so many. "Carried 6 Marines to safety," the older Marine said, his voice steady. "Took fire. That's the man we're honoring today." The room stirred again. The prosecutor, usually stern and unyielding, stood hesitantly. He knew the weight of the moment. With a voice filled with sincerity, he stepped forward and said, "Sir, I had no idea. Please, accept my sincerest apologies for how this case was handled." Elias, for the first time in years, felt something stir inside him. The room, once filled with whispers and cold stares, was now filled with respect. His shoulders straightened slightly, a quiet power returning to him. He hadn't been forgotten after all. Not by his fellow Marines, not by those who mattered. Judge Parker wiped away a tear, her voice trembling slightly as she addressed the court. "In light of these extraordinary developments," she began, her words carrying a weight few could understand, "all charges against Staff Sergeant Elias Carter are hereby dismissed, permanently." Her gavel came down with force, but the room had already risen to its feet. The entire courtroom stood, saluting the man who had once saved so many, and now, finally, was being honored. The sound of the gavel echoed through the courtroom, but it was drowned out by the quiet stir of people standing and saluting Elias Carter. Even the prosecutor, once so determined to convict, stood in respectful silence. The room was no longer a place of judgment, but a space of honor, a rare shift, one born of shared understanding. Elias blinked, the weight of what had just happened settling over him like a heavy blanket. For years he had wondered if anyone remembered, if his service had even mattered. But now, in this courtroom under the gaze of his fellow Marines and the judge who knew the depth of his sacrifice, Elias finally felt that someone did remember his name. The Master Sergeant approached, Elias with a tablet in hand. He was no longer a stranger, but someone who spoke with authority and compassion. "Sir," the Master Sergeant said, "we've been trying to reach you to correct your VA records. Your disability rating has been reassessed. You are now 100% service-connected, retroactive to your original discharge date." Elias's heart skipped a beat. He didn't understand. His hands trembled as he spoke, his voice a little rougher than usual. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means you're entitled to full back pay," the Master Sergeant continued, his voice steady. "Complete medical coverage, housing assistance, educational benefits, anything you need going forward, Staff Sergeant." Elias shook his head in disbelief. "Back pay?" he repeated. "For how long?" "For every year you've been out." The Master Sergeant replied, his voice unwavering. "It's all coming back to you." Elias's chest tightened as the realization hit him. It wasn't just the recognition, the awards, or the praise. It was the years of neglect, the struggles he had endured in silence, the nights spent sleeping in shelters. All of it was finally being corrected. After so many years of fighting for scraps, he was finally getting what he deserved. Before Elias could respond, a familiar figure appeared at the back of the room. It was Jimmy, the cook from Jefferson Street Cafe. His eyes were red, tears threatening to spill as he made his way to the front. The room quieted, a respectful hush filling the space as Jimmy approached Elias, his hands shaking slightly. "My dad used to tell me about a Marine who saved his platoon during Desert Storm," Jimmy said, his voice thick with emotion. "He said, 'If you ever meet a man named Elias Carter, you owe him everything.'" Jimmy paused, looking down at the ground for a moment before lifting his gaze to meet Elias's eyes. "I never knew that man was you," he said softly, his voice breaking. "Not until today." Elias felt a lump form in his throat, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel something other than the weight of survival. "I didn't do anything special," he murmured, his voice rough. Jimmy shook his head, his hands trembling as he reached out. "You saved my dad," he said simply. "You saved all of them." The prosecutor, now visibly moved by the turn of events, stepped forward. His demeanor had softened considerably, the professional mask he had worn earlier completely gone. He approached Elias, his head slightly bowed in acknowledgement. "Sir," he began, his voice sincere, I had no idea. Please accept my deepest apologies for how this case was handled." Elias nodded slowly, the full weight of the moment pressing down on him. For years he had lived in the shadows, forgotten by those who should have cared for him. But now, surrounded by Marines, by those who truly understood, he felt like he was finally being seen, finally being remembered. Judge Parker stood, her voice trembling as she addressed the room. "This courtroom is adjourned," she said softly, her words clear and final. But for Elias, it wasn't just an end. It was a new beginning. The journey he had walked for so many years, alone, forgotten, had finally come full circle. And now, for the first time in decades, he wasn't alone anymore. 2 weeks later, Elias Carter stood before a mirror, adjusting the buttons of a simple jacket. His new apartment was quiet, the walls bare except for one framed display. It was a collection of his military medals, the Navy Cross, his long-lost, Purple Hearts, and the other service awards that had once defined him. They were no longer just metal tokens of valor. They were pieces of his identity, finally returned to him after years of neglect and forgetfulness. Ross had tracked them down, recovered from a storage locker that had been sold off years ago. Every piece, a symbol of a life that was finally being acknowledged. Elias stared at them for a long time, the quiet echo of his past ringing in his ears. He hadn't expected any of this. To be seen, to be remembered, to be valued. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He opened it to find Olivia Parker standing there, not in her robes but simply dressed. She was holding a small box in her hands, her expression kind but serious. "May I come in, Sergeant Carter?" she asked, her voice warm but respectful. Elias smiled softly, stepping aside to let her in. "It's just Elias now," he replied gently, "and it's good to see you, Olivia." She nodded, stepping into the modest living room where the weight of both past and present hung in the air. They sat across from each other, a silence passing between them, unspoken, yet shared. Both of them had lived through the same tragedy, though from different sides. But now, for the first time, they found themselves connected in a way they had never expected. "I brought something," Olivia said, opening the small box she was holding. Inside, neatly arranged, were a bundle of worn letters, tied together, with twine. "They're from Jack. He wrote us every week while he was deployed," she explained. "This one mentions you. It's dated the day after you saved him." Elias's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the letter, his fingers brushing against the paper that carried his old comrade's words. Jack's handwriting was unmistakable, sharp and precise, full of the hope and optimism he had always carried. Elias slowly unfolded the letter and began to read aloud. "Don't worry about the news. I'm safe thanks to one of our NCOs, Staff Sergeant Carter. He did something yesterday that I still can't believe. When our unit was ambushed, he moved through enemy fire like it didn't exist. He refused to leave me even when I ordered him to. He said, 'No Marine gets left behind, not while I'm still breathing.'" Elias's voice cracked as he read those words, the weight of Jack's gratitude nearly too much to bear. He paused for a moment, swallowing hard before continuing. "I heard he made it to Germany. A few weeks later, his convoy hit an IED. I've always wondered if saving him just delayed the inevitable." Olivia's eyes softened, the years of grief she had carried mirrored in his own. She placed a hand gently on his. "He didn't die because of you," she said quietly, her voice full of understanding. "He lived the way he did because of you, because of the courage you showed that day." For the first time in 20 years, Elias allowed himself to believe it. He hadn't been a fool. He hadn't made it worse. Jack had lived because of him. Olivia shifted, her voice more contemplative. "After Jack died, I went to law school. I started the Veterans Court program, the housing initiatives, everything. Because of what he wrote about how the system forgets its own. People like you, Elias, who gave everything and then disappeared. Elias looked around the apartment. I'm not a hero, he said softly. I just did what needed to be done. Olivia smiled gently, the faintest hint of pride in her eyes. That's exactly what heroes always say, she replied. It's exactly what Jack said about you. The room was quiet again, but this time the silence was filled with something different, something healing. The past was still there, but it no longer held him prisoner. For the first time in years, Elias felt at peace with who he was, with what he had done. As Olivia stood to leave, she placed a hand on his shoulder. Jack used to say the measure of a Marine isn't what he does in front of a crowd. It's what he does when no one's watching. You lived that, Elias. Even when the world forgot. Elias stood a little taller as she left. Someone remembered my name, he said softly, watching her disappear down the hallway. And for the first time in his life, it wasn't just a name. It was a promise fulfilled. Outside, snow began to fall. Soft, quiet, and steady, covering the city in a gentle blanket of white. Elias stood by his window, watching the snowflakes drift down. The weight of years lost and struggles endured slowly began to lift from his shoulders, and in that stillness, something long broken inside him began to heal.